I really enjoy sitting down after a long day and relaxing by doing some casual dream surfing, but there's an annoying trend I've noticed in a lot of the creations I've played. People make some great, genuinely fun stuff, but they're absolutely awful at teaching people how to play them. Have you ever played a dream that right off the bat throws something like this at you and expects you to internalize it immediately? Don't get me wrong, these full lists of controls can be kind of useful, maybe as a reference that shows itself when you click the touchpad or something, or as a guide in a tech demo rather than a full game. But far too often do people try to use these to teach the controls of their game to first-time players. You may think, hey, these give all the necessary information the player needs. What's so wrong about showing one to the player to teach them the controls? Well, the long and short of it is that these control screens provide a lot of information with little to no context, which makes them hard to retain. Here's a simple example. Imagine you're dream surfing, jumping from creation to creation, a new one loads up, and you're hit with this. What are you supposed to do with this information? What do these numbers mean? Why are they tied to buttons? Now, you could sit here and memorize every single one despite not knowing what they're for, but if you're the average gamer, you'll probably just skip it and hope it's not important. Then you're hit with this. Suddenly, all those controls back there make sense. You know exactly what you need to do, but you can't remember how to do it. If only the controls were taught in a way that actually stuck in your brain with little effort, that also taught you why the controls themselves are useful. This is obviously a pretty dramatic example, but hopefully it gets the point across. When people play your game, they should be playing practically on instinct. Once the player makes a decision, their subsequent action should be as instantaneous as possible. This means people need to not just learn the controls, but internalize them. Luckily, there are fun, effective ways to do that, and that's what I'm here to teach you. The first thing to think about is minimizing the amount of information you need to throw at the player. One thing you can start with is making sure to follow conventional dreams controls as much as possible. Use left stick to move, X to jump, and so on, since people will already know and expect these controls. Look at this game, you have to walk up to a sign that tells you how to walk. Let that sink in for a second. That said, don't force yourself to use default dreams controls if it's important to the game you're making. You can get a lot of fun out of awkward control schemes and forcing people to rewire their brains. Another thing you can do to minimize controls is to try to reuse the same button for similar non-overlapping tasks. Can you share the same button for talking to an NPC and picking up an item? Or if you're making a third-person shooter, can you activate the flashlight while aiming down your sights? This isn't really universal advice. Just because you have multiple actions on one button doesn't mean you won't have to teach those actions separately. But if it works in your game and results in less buttons for someone to remember, consider trying it out. People also have less they need to remember if you provide contextual prompts in your game. Show controls as they're needed rather than in a tutorial. For example, rather than telling someone at the start, press square to interact with things, instead consider just making a little square button show up whenever you're near an interactable item. That's a pretty straightforward thing to do with logic, using a trigger zone and a text gadget. Adjust the text gadget so that it shows up in the world over the item. And use angle brackets with the name of the button to make the correct icon show up. Then adjust the trigger zone radius to be the distance at which you can interact with things, and use it to power on the text gadget. This comes with an added bonus. Not only does it tell you the controls, it tells you when you can actually interact with something in the game, and it prevents people from running around mashing square on everything. But remember to be consistent here. If you give a contextual prompt to one interactable object, you'd better give it to every interactable object or you're going to mislead people. This idea is extendable to a lot of situations too. You can show a prompt for a health pack button when you're low on health, or show a flashlight button when you enter a dark area. Now that you've minimized the number of controls you actually need to teach people, we can start talking about how to teach the remaining controls. If you've only got 2 or 3 buttons left, well, since that's a very low, non-overwhelming number, you can probably just list the controls. People will be able to remember them just fine. But for more complex control schemes, you'll have to be more careful. Here are some things to keep in mind. First, teach people things gradually. People retain things better when they learn and use things bit by bit. Introduce only 1 or 2 new buttons at a time and layer the new knowledge on top of old knowledge. For example, in this game I made called Definitely a Fashion Show, where you control each limb on a puppet separately using different buttons, I made sure to teach people the controls 1 limb at a time. When I introduced a new limb, I made sure they also needed to perform actions using the previous limbs before they could progress in the tutorial, until gradually they were controlling the entire body at once. Second, teach people things with context. When you're introducing a new control, make sure it's introduced in a scenario where people can immediately use it. Don't tell people how to shoot until they have something to shoot. Don't tell people how to jump unless you have some platforms nearby, and so on. If you're making a tutorial, try to make it interactive. Make people actually perform the actions you're telling them how to perform before they can continue. People internalize things far better by doing instead of watching. A third option, and this may sound weird given the rest of this tutorial, is to consider not trying to teach the controls at all. Instead, provide a safe space that lets people experiment until they've learned all the controls themselves, whether it's some kind of free play mode or a hub you can run around in. Giving people a sandbox where they can mess around and experiment is often one of the most fun ways to learn how to play a game, because it feels less like a lecture and more like genuine discovery. Finally, if you do decide to make a tutorial, the more invisible it is, the better. Rather than making a straight-up tutorial level that runs through a list of controls one by one, consider trying to design your early game to introduce the controls as people play the game. This isn't really something I can just tell you how to do because it depends very heavily on the specific game you're making. But if you can design your game in a way that people can pick up and learn just by playing the game, without anyone telling them exactly what to do or how to do it, that's the ultimate way to teach them. Let's go back to that number game for a second. Remember this terrible control scheme? Hey, if we just use a number pad that you can just type on using the imp, suddenly the controls are so intuitive that we don't even need to teach any controls. I mean, this game isn't much fun to begin with, it's kind of just math. My point is, people want to play your game, and pulling them out of the action and explaining how to do things can be pretty annoying. It's difficult striking a balance between hand-holding people through a strict, slow tutorial, and just letting them be, respecting their ability to figure things out for themselves. Just please, stop trying to make me memorize a million new button mappings every time I load up a new dream. Thanks.